New Thought Media Network. We are a global broadcast network of positive music, media, and entertainment, inspiring humanity's evolution along the journey of enlightenment and creating a world of love, peace, empowerment, and prosperity for all. New Thought Media Network. Positively inspiring.
New Thought Media Network is proud to present New Thought's Roots and Branches with Reverend Dr. Ruth Miller. Join us every Tuesday at 4 p.m. Mountain Time. Tune in live or watch anytime on our YouTube channel. Discover the rich history of New Thought and its impact on modern spirituality. Join Reverend Dr. Ruth Miller as she shares insights, stories, and teachings that inspire and uplift. Experience deep insights and transformative teachings that connect you to the roots of New Thought. Visit our YouTube channel to catch up on past episodes and join us live every Tuesday at 4 p.m. Connect with us and be part of the journey.
Hello there. I am Ruth Miller, and this is New Thought, Roots and Branches. And today, we're going to be looking at someone that most people have never heard of, Annie Rix Millets and her sister, Harriet Rix. They are the founders and the developers of Homes of Truth, which were located primarily on the West Coast. We'll look more at that. And of some marvelous, marvelous writings that many, many millions of people at the turn of this past century were reading and finding very, very helpful. If we look at our chart of the history of New Thought, we can see that they're down there near the bottom, all the modern folks. Everyone above them is the folks that have fed into the New Thought teachings. But these two were on the same planet with Emma and Charles and Myrtle and all those people who were there in the late 1800s. And if we look at the next slide, we can see that they're almost in the middle of the chart, the way that chart is laid out. Harriet and Annie Rix. If we look at the next one, you can see who they are, see what they looked like. Annie Rix married a man named Millets, and Harriet Rix, her sister, who was quite a bit younger. We can look at the next slide and see that what they did, creating these homes and sanctuaries of truth, started in 1887 in the San Francisco area. They created a journal that was worldwide and was one of the most amazing journals out there called Mastermind Journal, which is different from all the other ones that were going on in that time period, including the Unity Journal between 1911 and 1923. Almost all of their centers were located on the west coast of North America, but there were a few. And when they traveled around, particularly Annie would travel around and people would get so excited and they would create a new center. The ones that exist today are still in Alameda, the Home of Truth in Alameda, and the Sanctuary of Truth in Pasadena, California. And there are buildings that are still marked Homes of Truth up and down the West Coast, and one of them is still a New Thought church. I was having a delightful conversation with a new young minister who has taken over and made it a really upscale and modern church. It's chartreuse in color with purple drawers, that's cool, purple front doors. There we go. And, they have jazz musicians on Wednesday night, and it's a lively center where people are waking up to truth. In our next slide, we get to learn a little bit about the two of them. Annie is the older one. She was born in 1856, and Harriet came along in 1863 in the San Francisco area. We know virtually nothing beyond their birth dates and the fact that they were living in that part of the world. Annie was a school teacher and became a school teacher, as most women did at that time, in her early 20s, late teens, early 20s, and was very effective as a school teacher and took those skills quite a ways as we move forward in her work with New Thought. Harriet, being the youngest in the family, stayed with their parents until they didn't need her anymore. But she began to work closely with Annie along about 1889. And that was a very important year. In the next slide, we see that the launching of their life together, their career, was a lecture by Emma Curtis Hopkins in San Francisco in 1887. Actually, it was the full series, all 12 lessons that Emma would do. And that series caused Annie to wake up. And she said, I found my calling. She quit teaching that year and went to work with her good friend Sadie Gorey in Sadie Gorey's metaphysical or spiritual bookstore. Now, at that time, all of this was called Christian Science. There wasn't another name. Quimby had called it the Science of Christ, and everyone kind of picked up on that. But later on, by the late 1880s, by 1889, Mary Baker Eddy had made it very clear that only her tradition could be called Christian Science. So they created in this little spiritual bookstore a Christian Science home, and then by 1888, changed that to the Home of Truth. Very quickly, as soon as they started letting people know that they could study and learn more about these metaphysical principles that led to healing and financial prosperity, they outgrew that bookstore. And they took over the whole building. They were offering classes, and then their students were offering classes in the various rooms above the bookstore. And that was when they named it the Home of Truth. By 1889, as we see in the next slide, Emma invited Annie, this well-trained teacher and obviously very effective teacher, to come teach at Emma's new seminary. You may recall, you probably don't, but in case you do, in 1886, Emma had moved to Chicago and they'd formed the Emma Hopkins Seminary, and then Mary Plunkett in 1888 had taken their mailing list and most of the administrative materials to New York. And so Emma started over in the summer of 1888, and that would have been when she called Annie in to help teach. By 1891, Annie had completed Emma's training program for ministers, along with Charles and Myrtle Fillmore, and they were all ordained in the same class in January of 1891. And another member of their class, Paul Millets, proposed to Annie, who, as you can see, is now well into her 30s, and she agreed. So she married Paul Millets and became Annie Rix Millets. So when you look for her, don't look for Annie Rix. You might not find her. You have to find Annie Rix Millets. And from 91 to 93, she was on the board and on the staff, and there's a lot of places where you see her name mixed into the records of Emma's Theological Seminary in Chicago. 1893 was the World Exhibition in Chicago, and Annie helped staff the women's booth there, and then she realized she needed to go back to the West Coast. So on our next slide, we see that she returned to San Francisco after that show and started to create this idea of more homes of truth. So she saw that everything was doing well with her friend Sadie Gorey, and so she went on and started doing more. She also wrote her first published article, which was published in the Unity magazine, Charles and Myrtle's magazine, called The Manifestation of God Through Judas Iscariot. Wow, was that heretical. And it was the first place that the idea that Judas Iscariot represented the generative chakra, the generative energy center in the human body, was actually published. And Charles built on that idea that they had all learned when they were studying with Emma Hopkins in his texts that became the book, The 12 Powers of Man. Then that article was so well received that she continued to write many, many more articles, helped to write the textbooks, helped to form the teaching arm of Unity all the way to 1911, even though she was now living on the West Coast, through writing and, well, occasionally the telegram, they were able to get a lot of that done. She traveled sometimes too, and we'll look more at that. In 1894, she and her husband moved down to LA to establish a home of truth there, and several of them were established, and one of them remains as the Pasadena Sanctuary of Truth, where one of the versions of the Emma Curtis Hopkins Gospel series was retained. And we were able to make that into a book, if you ever want to check that out, at Wise Woman Press, a division of portalcenterpress.com. All right. Now, what was beginning to happen, of course, the more she wrote, the more people heard about her, the more people wanted to hear from her. And so Annie began to be a speaker. And in the next slide, we can see that she was going around the country giving talks. When she was working with the Unity folks on their campus, she would go to the Unity Temple that Charles had built in Kansas City. And it's still there. There's Unity Plaza and this large, beautiful church. And she was one of the speakers there up until 1911. And then she became a founding member of the International New Thought Alliance, which was formed in a Boston meeting in 1914, and by 1918 was the means by which the various New Thought teachers who had thought of themselves as Christian Science teachers 20 years before, it was the way they got together and began to teach and work together. So Annie, at that meeting, met with Emma Curtis Hopkins again, who was the president of the Alliance at that point, but she also got to meet Ernest Holmes, who was a very young man who was trying to understand how this all worked. And that was the meeting where Ernest met Nona Brooks and discovered that her secret is omnipresence. Well, he didn't try to find out Annie's secret because it was blazoned in everything she had written and said. And we will look at that here shortly. While she was in Boston, she gave the commencement address to a class of students who were graduating from the seminary that was in Boston at that time, not the Christian Science Metaphysical College, but another New Thought seminary. As we look forward, we find that while Annie's doing all of that, Harriet has decided to take the property that her parents had in Alameda and turn that over to make possible a home of truth in Alameda. And I'm going to show you in the next slide a picture. This is quite a recent picture of the home of truth on the island of Alameda. It's on Grand Street. You can't miss it. Grand is the one that goes all the way up and down the island. And it used to be, when I was visiting there, it had kind of deteriorated into a dark brown stain. And now they've freshened it up and they've got new paint, all kinds of places, and new plantings. And they have their website, which is homeoftruth.org. And you can see here one of the things that they say on that website. Today, many who are simply looking for a fresh perspective, parenthesis, a new thought about God, close parenthesis, may find a home here from which to continue their spiritual journey. The home of truth is welcoming and affirming of all people. We believe that all life is expressing God as that I am from Exodus. We honor the founders and pioneers of the early New Thought movement. We are a community of people committed to deepening and even deepening our own experiences of the divine within and throughout our lives, and supporting those who come to the home of truth. It's a small congregation. The last time I was there were 15, 20 people there. But They also have a number of other things going on there. They were and have always been a spiritual center where people can practice yoga, learn about the different religious traditions, even engage in rituals from interfaith teachings. And in large part, this is because both Annie and Harriet were committed to the realization that all paths lead to the same place. When Annie had been working with her friend in the bookstore, she took advantage of the opportunity and studied everything she could about other religions. And then she worked with Emma Hopkins and the Fillmores, who also were looking at very many other religious traditions. And so they all got it, and they accepted that notion. As we go on to the next slide, we see what the main concepts are in the Homes of Truth, the essence of what Annie and Harriet wanted everyone to understand. First, God, which could be called infinite intelligence or divine consciousness, is supreme, universal, and everlasting. This main concept is the foundation, isn't it? It is everywhere. The realization of universal consciousness, universal intelligence, infinite, that is all that is supreme. Nothing else exceeds it in any way and exceeds any idea of space and time. This is the foundation principle for all New Thought movements and is expressed in this unique way in the Homes of Truth main concepts. The second principle, that we are each an individual expression of this one power, which manifests uniquely through each being, is actually the second principle of unity also, that we all have a divine spark in us. We are all an expression of that divinity. And therefore, when we meet anyone or see anyone or think about anyone, we need to remember that they too are God in expression. The third principle, the third concept that they want us to understand in Harriet and Annie's teachings and in the Homes of Truth, the highest spiritual principle, they say, is having a personal connection with the God of our understanding, which guides us in loving ourselves and others unconditionally. One of the lessons that Emma would teach was, I live and move and have my being in the God of my understanding. Who and what I think God is guiding me. Who and what I think my good is pushing and pulling me on. Who and what I think the infinite all that is functioning as, is making my world be what I am experiencing. So recognizing that what I understand God to be is critical to my experience of life is a huge part of what the Rix sisters invited us to look at. If you've done any work with the work of David Hawkins, the Power versus Force, or the Eye of the I, you may be aware that he has a map of consciousness. And one of the things that he has is the level of consciousness we're functioning at is tied to our view of God, and is also tied to our experience of the world. So it's this functionality. As we move up in consciousness, our view of God changes. As our view of God changes, we move up in consciousness. They cannot be separated. And as we move up in consciousness, then we have different skills and abilities, and we connect with people in the world around us in a very different way. So they had the essence of what David Hawkins discovered in the 1980s, understood in the 1880s in the Homes of Truth. Well, the 1890s anyway. Number 4, our mental states are carried forward into manifestation and become our experience in daily living, including prayer and other spiritual practices. Our mental state is what we are experiencing. This is a little different from what Unity was teaching, and I think is probably why Annie moved away from Unity in 1911. She got it, that it's who I am being in that understanding of what I think God is that is showing up in the world around me. And that when I enter into the prayer state, that is one of the ways I am being. And the more time I spend in that state, the more the good becomes manifest in my world. And so Annie was saying it's not just about being prayerful to make things happen in our world or to manifest. It is whatever we are being right now. And our other spiritual practices can contribute to that. Now, Annie and Harriet didn't put it this way, but my version of spiritual practice comes down to what I call the 4 S's. And as I look at their materials, I think maybe they were living these. And my version is, first we study, we listen, or we read, or we observe something that is spiritually enlivening us, or that is causing us to remember a deep understanding. After we study, we go into the silence. We take that in, we contemplate it, we make it our own, we internalize it as much as possible. After study and silence, then we share it, because it's in the sharing that we have the whole verbal body connection with that concept and that understanding that has come our way. And the way Emma taught that was make this your own and teach it so that you can have permanent effects in your practices. And then the 4th S, we have study, silence, sharing, and then service. Are we serving in the world? Are we allowing that spirit to express itself through us in a way that others benefit? And these are the kinds of spiritual practices that then can allow us to be manifesting the essence of spirit, the beauty, the joy, the wonderfulness that we call God. Yes? So let's look at what Annie had to say about that. On the next slide, she says, do not stop praying, but change your prayers. Okay? Normally, people were taught, recite the Lord's Prayer, recite the Hail Mary, say these words, and that's your prayer. And she's saying, no, change your prayers. Pray without ceasing. That is, always be in a state of prayer. Always feel that divine connection. Pray in every right way you can think of. Whatever that is, it might be dance, it might be song, it might be a kind of movement, it might be writing, it might be just loving someone, right? And then she says, at last you will speak the words that reach God. And those words are the words that are our expression of who and what we are right now, that is so in sync with our understanding of the divine that there is no separation in our experience anymore. And that, for her, is where we want to be in prayer. The next point, the words that are the substance out of which the answer to your prayer is made, okay? So when we are in that place of being in total sync with the all that is, the substance, the spiritual substance that takes the form of our bodies, of our world, of our relationships, of our finances, whatever it is that is form, is already in perfect alignment, because we're in perfect alignment and will be manifest as we are mentally framing our being in that moment, the mental state we are in. Yes? And then the next point, for this is true. Out of your own words are formed the manifestation you desire to show forth. Now, this is from one of her books. She wrote a number of them. We'll look at them. All things are possible to them that believe, which is a quote from the New Testament. And the thing is, it's not saying that those that believe a particular doctrine in the Christian church can experience all things that are possible. She is saying that those who feel and know the oneness, the wholeness, the already existingness of that which they are ready to experience must have and can't not have all that they are ready to receive. All things are possible. In our next slide, we'll see more of what she says. And this is from the talk that she gave when she was in Boston attending that commencement. She says, according to appearances, there have been many gods as well as many men, many things, and men separate from God. Whoa. And the great delusion of mankind consists in this belief that there is another being besides God, man, quite separate from God, another substance besides God called matter, and another power besides God, the good, called evil. So according to appearances, according to the culture, according to all the ways that we have probably been taught if we didn't grow up in New Thought. So that's where she starts, and then she goes on in the next paragraph. The doctrine that destroys this illusion, this delusion of separateness, and proves the unity between God and man, between God and his world, between God and the one power good, is that doctrine called the at-one-ment, often pronounced atonement. She says the word atonement defines itself when it is divided into its syllables. The first syllable is at. The second is one. The last syllable is ment, this Latin ending, meaning state of being. So whenever you see anyone talking about the atonement, you might want to reconsider, as Annie suggests, and as the Course in Miracles also suggests, and reframe that to at-one-ment. It is the state of being in which we know without a doubt there is no separation between the power that is good, the presence that is love, and the essence of all beingness, our source. In the next slide, we get to see some of Annie's writings. These are a few of the books that have been reprinted in the title page of another book, Impersonal Healing, Both Riches and Honor, which is actually what most people are aware of. It's that phrase is out of the New Testament, but it's Annie telling us, you can be wealthy and you can be honorable at the same time. And here's how, right? And then the other one is the one that's in this slide is a compilation of some of the issues of their journal, Mastermind, that, like all New Thought journals, was a combination of them writing articles, Annie and Harriet and some of their other teachers, and the letters and responses to letters from people who have had experiences using the material. In the next slide, we see some more reprints of Annie's works. And the renewal of the body ended up being a very important part of her development and of her presentation. But here's that book, All Things Are Possible, that I was reading from earlier. And then Spiritual Housekeeping. That's her attempt to help us get into that practice mode where we are actually cleaning out those thoughts, those ways of thinking, and filling the space with the thoughts and ways of thinking that are supportive of who and what we are. So those are a few of her books. They're all in reprints. They're all available online. And they are pretty amazing stuff if you haven't found her writing yet. But then we get her sister. Now, Harriet was mostly involved in setting up the Homes of Truth, the Home of Truth in Alameda, but she was very supportive for the others because while Annie was a marvelous teacher, she was not much of an organizer. Harriet seemed to have been more of an organizer. And she's trying to help people understand that the ways we have been taught to get things done are not necessarily the most effective. She says, in her book, Rich Mentality, Another Way to Be Prosperous, she says, you are not here to work by strenuous effort to make life. And again, she is very much in alignment with Emma Hopkins' teachings here, who says that man does not prosper by his labor, right? as she goes on, she says, Harriet says, you are here under the blessing of God to live a life of wholesome, loving kindness, of success and goodwill toward each other, bringing out of your own nature, the divine self. God lives in you every moment. All right? So this isn't the old doctrine of humanity must be on the planet and work very hard if they're going to have a living. No, this is the doctrine that says God is working in and through us to will and do and be who we are most fully. In other words, to support our fullest development. So Harriet was helping people to be more relaxed in their accomplishment with that paragraph. And the next point, she says, if you are conscious that God is your very life and being, you will not work to express it in the terms of mortal consciousness, in dollars and cents and salary. You won't have to. When you know that infinite supply that is willing for your full development, no matter what, is dwelling in you, around you, through you, as you, and for you, then you won't attempt to try to acquire anything, whether it be a salary or money in another way. You won't be trying to change your consciousness, because your consciousness already is that infinite intelligence. So Harriet managed to express in very practical terms the essence of what both Annie and Emma, their teachers, were telling them. She continued to work in the Home of Truth in Alameda and to help with the Mastermind Journal long after Annie passed away. In 1924, Annie was in LA. And there's a newspaper article. I was going to show it to you, but it's almost impossible to read. It says, "Cult Leader Body is Buried," is the headline. And Mrs. Annie Rix Millets was a cult leader in Los Angeles with her Home of Truth. And she had been so convinced that God's loving presence was enlivening her cells that she knew that even had she gone through the death process, she wouldn't have to remain on the other side of the veil, as it were. Well, she knew it, but unfortunately the coroner didn't. And after over a week of having her body and having everyone be in vigil around it, be available for people to support, the coroner said, no, this is becoming a health problem. We must bury this body. I don't think anyone has gone back to check, but I wouldn't be too surprised if, like Yogananda and many others before her, many of the saints in the Catholic tradition, they would bring her forward out of that grave and show very little deterioration, because she knew that God's life was in the cells of her body. Yes. Her sister, as I say, was much younger, right? And she lived a number more years and was building that Home of Truth, maintaining that Home of Truth in Alameda that whole time, and being supportive of the others. Unlike most of the other founders that we have talked to or talked about in this show, these two did not build an organization, and they didn't have someone in their organization building an organization, which is what happened for some people. So the whole thing has sort of fallen apart. The Mastermind Journal went on for a couple of years after Annie was no longer able to edit it, but Harriet wanted to focus on the Home of Truth and the congregation she had. And then the other Homes of Truth were just fine with the people who Harriet and Annie had taught, but there wasn't a succession process. There wasn't a way to teach new people how to be this main pillar of a place, a sanctuary, a place to come home to a new thought about God. Nonetheless, in Alameda, the place continues, And the Sanctuary of Truth in Pasadena continued well into the 90s and the 2000s. So yes, we have some tiny little tidbits, and we have all of these books. And what's really cool to notice is that these books are being published and reprinted and made available so many ways and in several languages, so that the teachings are being maintained, even though the organization and the structures haven't been. And what I'd like to do is go back, if my helper can help me, to go all the way back to the beginning when we were looking at Harriet. All the way back, almost to the beginning of the show. Because what we can see here are two women of their age. Women who are wearing the classic hairstyle, women who are wearing the classic becoming but not extravagant clothing, and people who are, as you can see in their eyes, very present. I love that little half smile on Annie Rix's face. And I love that Harriet, and I'm sad this is really the only photograph we've been able to find in any of the archives, but we're continuing to look because all the archives are now at Unity Village, and more of us are going to be able to go through them. In any case, this is the only photo we have, but we can see the family resemblance for sure. And we can see that willingness to look beyond. That's what I see in that photo of Harriet. She is focused on what is here, but she is looking beyond for the people that she is helping. And this is in many ways, the hallmark of a New Thought founder. We are focusing on what is, or they were focusing on what is, and then looking beyond, being fully present in the moment and seeing the possibilities, knowing that the infinite all that is always expanding into becoming more and more of what is possible. Harriet and Annie Rix, not very well known for the last 50, 60, 80, even 100 years, but becoming more known as people are looking for how we could possibly be more prosperous, more centered in spirit, and experiencing more good in spite of what the world around us seems to be doing. I'm not spending as much time as I usually do because, well, frankly, we don't know very much more about these women, but I think their teachings really, really ring a bell. And I'm very glad that they did the work that they did. And I look forward to seeing how you apply the lessons that you could learn from them. Thank you very much for joining me here on New Thought, Roots and Branches. And I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.